She heard the door not quite shut, and through the gap Lynette Hale heard her own wedding undone for the third time, before anyone had troubled to tell her it was happening at all. She stood in the corridor in her second-best muslin, a basket of white ribbon still over her arm, and did not move. Because moving would have meant being seen, and being seen would have meant being pitied, and pity was the one coin she had never learned to spend. She would remember, afterward, counting the black and white tiles under her feet while she listened, 11, 12, 13. The way her father had taught her to count coin, evenly, so the hand does not shake. She did not yet know that this was only the third postponement, and that a fourth was coming, and that the fourth would cost her the folded gown, the cottage, and very nearly the man himself. Inside the study, Sir Robert Ainsworth's voice was low and careful, the voice of a man reading aloud something he wished he were not. "Michaelmas is 11 weeks off, Your Grace. Your father's will is explicit. Unmarried past your 30th birthday, the Fenmore lands pass out of your hand entirely to the nearest kinsman standing. You have delayed this wedding twice already. A third delay, on the back of 2, will set the whole county wondering why a duke cannot bring himself to the altar with a woman he claims to love. I am aware of the calendar, Robert. Then you are aware it does not care what you have discovered, or half discovered, or merely suspect. It simply arrives." There was a silence long enough that the basket grew heavy on her arm. When the Duke spoke again, his voice had gone quiet in the particular way she had learned to dread. The stillness he wore like armor when something had cost him more than he meant to say aloud. "Send word to the vicar. 3 weeks. Not this Thursday. And Miss Hale? I will tell her myself." He did not tell her himself, not truly, and that was the shape of the whole business, understood by her standing in the corridor before he ever came to find her, that the man she was to marry would rather carry a weight alone across a room than set it down where she could see its size. She had known him 8 months. She had loved him, she thought, for at least 6 of them, though she had never once said so aloud, because he had never once asked her to, and because the arrangement between them had been built, from its very first hour, on a different vocabulary altogether, a vocabulary of ledgers and bargains, in which love, if it existed, had not yet been entered as a line. She set the ribbon down on the hall table, corner to corner, the way she set down everything, the way her father had taught her to close a book that still had truth left in it, evenly, without slamming, so that nothing important got creased. Then she went to find Mrs. Betts, because a woman could not stand in a corridor forever pretending she had not heard what she had heard, and because there was, after all, a wedding to unmake for the 3rd time. And someone would have to write to the flower man in the village before the roses arrived for nothing. She had got as far as the 2nd stair when he came out of the study behind her, and there was no pretending then that she had not been standing exactly where she had been standing. "Lynette," she turned. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been awake since some hour with no clock on it. "Your Grace, you heard. I heard enough arithmetic to do the rest myself." She kept her chin level. It cost her something, and she made certain it did not show, because showing it would have been its own kind of asking, and she had promised herself, the first time this happened, that she would not ask twice. "I can explain none of it tonight," he said, "and very little of it at all, and I am aware that is no answer, and I am asking you regardless to let it stand as one for 3 weeks more. That is what you asked in June. And in April. I know what I asked in April. Then you will forgive me if I do not clap my hands at the sound of it a 3rd time." She said it gently. She had never once, in 8 months, raised her voice to him, not for want of temper, but because she had learned early that quiet cut him deeper than shouting ever could, and some low, ungenerous part of her was glad of that. Tonight, I am not asking what it is, Julian. I have asked 3 times and been handed silence 3 times, and I have grown tired of the shape of my own asking. I am only telling you that a woman can be patient or she can be a fool, and I begin to suspect I no longer know which one I have been. Something crossed his face then, quick as a bird through a window, gone before she could read it entire. He closed his hand around the signet ring on his smallest finger, the old habit he had, turning it once, as though checking it were still there. 3 weeks, he said again, and it was not quite a plea and not quite an order, and she understood, watching him, that he believed with his whole grieved heart that silence was a mercy he was doing her, when in truth it was only a bill he was leaving her to settle later, with interest. She did not answer that. She only inclined her head. The small correct motion Lady Augusta had drilled into her the first winter she came to Harrow Hall, with 2 trunks and her father's account book, and nothing else, and went down the last stair to begin, for the 3rd time, the quiet, humiliating labor of writing round to say that the wedding would not, after all, be Thursday. She found Mrs. Betts in the linen room, counting pillow slips with the ferocity of a woman who counted things so she would not have to feel them. "Postponed," Mrs. Betts said, before Lynette had opened her mouth, and did not look up. "I can always tell. You get very straight in the shoulders. 3 weeks. He say why. He never says why." Mrs. Betts set down her count and looked at her properly then, the way she did perhaps twice a year, when the household nonsense fell away and only the 2 of them were left in a room. "I have kept this house since before he could walk it without falling, Miss Hale, and I will tell you what I know of him, which is more than his own aunt knows. He does not delay because his heart has cooled. He delays because he has found some manner of trouble and has decided, God help him, that a duke's duty is to carry trouble alone, the way his father carried it, and his father before him, until it killed the both of them early and left a boy of 19 to run an estate he was not ready for. It is not you he is protecting himself from. It is you he is protecting." That is a very generous reading of a silence. Mrs. Betts, it is the only reading I have found that has ever once proved wrong about him. It had begun, all of it, 8 months before, on a Tuesday, over a column of figures that would not reconcile. Lynette had come to Harrow Hall the winter after her father died, when the little apothecary shop in Little Aldern had been sold to pay what debts a good and careless man leaves behind him, and Lady Augusta, the Duke's aunt, had wanted a companion who could read aloud without stumbling, and add a bill without a slate. Josiah Hale had kept the parish accounts for 30 years alongside his powders and his tinctures, and he had taught his only daughter arithmetic the way other fathers taught daughters embroidery, patiently at the kitchen table, by candlelight, with a saying he repeated so often it had worn a groove in her, the way water wears a groove in stone. Every entry balances, in the end, he used to say, if you have the patience to find its pair. She had not known, that first winter, what use such patience would ever be to her, beyond keeping Lady Augusta's household books straight. Then, one Tuesday, the estate steward's quarterly summary had come to the drawing-room for the Duke's signature, and Lynette, sorting Lady Augusta's correspondence at the same table, had noticed without meaning to that a column of tenant rents did not sum to its stated total, out by £4 6 shillings, a discrepancy so small a man in a hurry would have signed straight past it. She had said nothing. It was not her place to say anything. But the Duke had caught her looking at the page a second time longer than politeness required, and had asked her, direct as a man unused to being watched, what she saw there that troubled her, and she had told him, and he had checked it, and she had been right. That was the whole of the courtship's beginning, £4 6 shillings, and neither of them had thought, at the time, that it was a courtship at all. He had come to find her again within the week, not for her face, which she had been told often enough was plain enough to be forgettable, but for the quality of attention she brought to a page of numbers which he had never once found in a drawing room. He had put the proposal to her the way he put most things, without ornament. "I require a wife by Michaelmas of next year, or lose the Fenmore lands to my cousin," he had told her, standing in the estate office with the ledgers between them like a third party to the conversation. "I do not offer you romance, Miss Hale, because I do not know that I have any left in me to offer, my parents having spent what I had of it in the dying, rather early and rather badly. I offer you a household of your own, freedom from want for the whole of your life, and a husband who will never once mistake you for a fool, which I understand is not nothing in your circumstance." She had looked at him a long moment before she answered, turning the offer over the way she turned over a suspect entry, hunting its pair. "That is a very tidy bargain, Your Grace. I wonder you have not been besieged with acceptances. I have had several. I found none of them tidy. Most young ladies of my acquaintance require to be told they are loved before they will be told they are wanted, and I have found I can manage only the second, honestly. Then I will tell you plainly what I require in return, since you have been plain with me. I would rather be your bad bargain than another man's good one. If I marry you on these terms, I will not be managed like a household account, entered and forgotten. You will tell me the truth even when it costs you to tell it. That is my price, and it is not negotiable, whatever the Fenmore lands are worth." He had agreed, that day, with the particular gravity of a man signing something he intended to honor, and for 6 months he had kept the bargain well enough that she had let herself begin, without quite admitting it, to love him. It was only in the last 2 months, since the first postponement, that he had begun, gently and with what she now understood to be the very best of intentions, to break it. Mrs. Betts, refolding the pillow slips, watched her go still over the memory. "You are thinking about the £4.6, she said. "How did you know? You go very straight in the shoulders for that, too." The wedding guests had not yet all been told, and word of the third postponement traveled through Harrow Hall and down into Little Aldern faster than any letter could have carried it, the way such things always did, borne by grooms and dairymaids and the vicar's own sister, who kept, it was said, a running wager book on whether the wedding would happen by Christmas at all, the odds lengthening with each fresh delay. Linnet bore the sympathy of the servants' hall and the sly amusement of the village with the same even face, because a face, she had learned, was the one ledger a person could balance entirely by will. It was into this atmosphere that Aldous Penrose arrived at the hall 2 mornings later, immaculate as always, his gloves the color of fresh cream, his cousin's steward and closest intimate since they had been boys together, the one relation Julian trusted without reservation, because Aldous had managed the estate faithfully, everyone said, through the whole grim decade of his uncle's decline and his cousin's grief. He found Linnet in the rose walk with her work-basket and greeted her with the particular warmth he kept in reserve for exactly such mornings. "Miss Hale, I am so very sorry for the disappointment. You bear it with more grace than I could manage, I think, were I in your slippers. One learns to, Mr. Penrose. I only hope you do not trouble yourself hunting for the reason behind it. Some doors are better left closed, my dear. I have only ever wanted to keep this family safe, and I promise you the kindest thing you can do for all of us is to let me and Sir Robert manage what wants managing, and simply wait." He smiled as he said it, and adjusted the cuff of his glove with one careful finger, and it was, she thought afterward, the gentlest threat she had ever been handed in her life. delivered with such tenderness that she had very nearly thanked him for it before she understood what it was. She said only that she was grateful for his concern, and watched him go, and did not know yet why the smallness of her unease had sharpened, in that moment, into something with an edge. That afternoon, helping Mrs. Betts sort a chest of old estate correspondence bound for the parish archive, her hand closed on a torn corner of ledger paper, wedged between two unrelated letters, a scrap no larger than a playing card, in a hand she knew instantly and would have known blindfold, because it had taught her every numeral she could write. Her father's hand. On an estate ledger. Dated 11 months before his death. She sat very still with it a long moment, the way she had learned to sit still with anything that frightened her, and then she folded it, corner to corner, and put it inside the cover of her own small book, and told no one, because she did not yet know what it meant, only that it meant something, and that some things are better carried quietly until their weight can be understood. It was 3 days later that Julian came to find her in the estate office in the evening, uninvited, and stood a moment in the doorway before he spoke, watching her the way a man watches something he has decided he must be honest about. At least in part. "I have been unfair to you," he said. "Not for the first time. I find I am becoming rather practiced at it. You are not unfair, Julian. You are merely silent, which is its own kind of unfairness, dressed better. Will you help me with something, then, in place of an apology I am not yet able to give in full?" He set the Western tenant rolls on the desk between them, the very rolls whose arithmetic had first drawn his eye to her 8 months before, and she understood, looking at them, that he was handing her the one language in which he knew how to be honest, even when he could not yet be honest in words. They worked through the evening side by side, her father's training moving through her hands like an old song, and somewhere past 10 o'clock she found an error of his own making, a transposed figure, and laughed before she could stop herself, a short surprised sound she had not made in weeks. He looked up at her, startled, and then, astonishingly, laughed too, low and real, the first true laugh she had heard out of him since the spring, and she marked it the way she marked everything that mattered, quietly, and kept it. "There is a shadow over your father's name," he said later, when the laughter had gone and the candle had burned low, "that I mean to see lifted entire before I let it come anywhere near you. That is the whole of what I can tell you tonight, and I know it is not enough, and I am asking you to trust me regardless, because the alternative is to hand you a wound I am not yet certain is even real." She thought of the torn scrap folded inside her book upstairs, and said nothing of it, and told herself she was protecting him exactly as he believed he was protecting her, and did not yet see that two people can ruin the same bridge from opposite ends, with the very same good intention. The letter came to Sir Robert 8 days after that, delivered by a hand no one could later trace, purporting to be a confession in Josiah Hale's own script, found, the accompanying note claimed, among old estate papers long overlooked. It stated, in words that read almost exactly like the dry, careful cadences of a country apothecary keeping careful books, that Josiah Hale had for years quietly diverted rents from the Fenmore tenants into his own accounts, and that he had meant, before his death, to confess it, and had not found the courage. Julian read it standing in Sir Robert's study, with his hand closed hard around the signet ring, and did not, even then, go to find Linnet and lay it before her, because he could not yet bear to watch her face receive it, and because some unhealed, unexamined part of him, the part that had buried a mother and a father within 18 months of each other and learned from both deathbeds that love means bearing the worst of a thing alone so no one else has to, decided in that study that he would find the truth of it himself before he let it touch her at all. It was the kindest, most catastrophic decision he had made since the bargain began, and it cost the both of them 9 more weeks. He postponed the wedding a third time formally that week, telling Sir Robert only that matters required settling, and did not tell Lynette what those matters were, and did not know, standing in his own study with the forged letter locked in his desk, that what looked like an innocent inheritance, her father's good name, had just become the very weapon aimed back at the two of them both. Lynette felt the change in him before she understood its cause, a fresh withdrawal beneath the old one, a new carefulness in how he looked at her, as though she were a page he was afraid to turn too quickly. She asked him twice what had altered, and was twice told nothing had, in a voice too even to be believed, and on the second occasion, walking back through the long gallery afterward, she came upon Aldous Penrose waiting for her with an expression of such rehearsed sorrow that she knew, before he spoke a word, that he had been waiting there on purpose. "Miss Hale, I wonder if I might speak plainly, where my cousin cannot bring himself to. Please, there is a difficulty concerning your late father's dealings with this estate, a serious one, which I have labored to keep from spreading beyond this house out of regard for you, though I confess it grows harder daily to contain. I have come to offer you a kindness, though I fear you will not hear it as one at first. £500 settled quietly upon you, and passage arranged to a cousin of your own choosing in whatever county you like. If you would consent to release my cousin from this engagement before the difficulty becomes a scandal, neither of you can survive. He is too honorable to ask it of you himself. I am not burdened with quite so much honor, and so I ask it in his stead, for both your sakes." She looked at him a long moment and thought of her father at the kitchen table with his patient candle, and of the torn scrap folded in her book upstairs, and felt something in her go very cold and very clear, the way a column of figures goes clear the instant you see where the error truly lies. "You are offering to pay me, Miss Penrose, to disappear. I am offering to spare you both a great deal of pain." "No," she said, and it cost her everything she had not to let her voice shake, because £500 was more money than she had seen in her whole life, and the offer of a quiet exit after 3 public humiliations was in its own way the kindest trap she had ever been shown. "I will not be paid to vanish, Miss Penrose, from a house I have done nothing to disgrace. If there is a difficulty concerning my father, I mean to know its whole shape myself, in the light, before I let any man settle it for me in the dark, however well he dresses the settling." Something flickered behind Penrose's eyes then, gone as quickly as it came, and he inclined his head and left her, and she stood alone in the gallery a long while afterward, proud of herself and frightened in equal measure, not yet understanding that she had just refused the very bribe the story's later mercy would be measured against. The 4th postponement came without ceremony and without explanation at all, which was somehow worse than the previous 3 combined. The guests had begun arriving that very morning, carriages already turning up the long drive, when Sir Robert came quietly to find Julian in the estate office and left 10 minutes later, and Julian did not come to find Lynette himself this time. He sent Mrs. Betts instead, unable, it seemed, even to face the asking, and Mrs. Betts stood in the doorway of Lynette's room with a face gone entirely without its usual dryness, and said only, "It is postponed again, my dear. He has not told me why. He has not told anyone why. I am so very sorry." Lynette sat a long moment on the edge of the bed, where the bridal gown lay spread in its tissue, white against the counterpane, and found that this time, unlike the first 3, no anger came, and no tears came either, only a great, quiet stillness, the stillness of a ledger finally closed, because the entries would not balance, and never had. She rose and crossed the room and lifted the gown and folded it, corner to corner, with the same care she gave every closing thing, smoothing each fold flat beneath her palm, the way her father had taught her to smooth the cover of a book that held no more use for opening. She left it at the center of the bed where it would be found. She wrote no long letter, only a single line on a fresh sheet, set beside the gown, weighted with her father's ledger's twin, the small cheap notebook Lady Augusta had once given her. I have not left because I stopped believing you love me. I have left because I have stopped believing you will ever let me carry anything beside you. When you are ready to set a burden down where I can see it, you will know where to find me. She took only her father's account book, the true one, the one with 30 years of parish sums in his own careful hand, and a single change of clothes, and was gone from Harrow Hall before the first gray showed over the eastern hedge. Walking the 3 miles into Little Aldern in the dark to the cottage of her father's old friend the miller's widow, who asked no questions and put the kettle on. It was Mrs. Betts who found the gown at first light and stood over it a long while before she went, white-faced, to wake the Duke, and it was the sight of his face on being shown it, she said afterward. That frightened her more than anything that had happened in all 4 of the wedding's failed mornings, because it was the face of a man discovering, one full turn too late, exactly what his silence had been costing. Mrs. Betts did not spare him. You have spent 9 weeks protecting that girl from a truth she has more right to than you do, Your Grace. And this morning she has shown you plainly what a woman is worth when a man will not trust her with her own history. I have known you since you were breeched. I loved your mother. I will say to you now what I would have said to her. God rest her. If your father had ever once let her carry a burden beside him instead of behind him, you have kept her safe from everything in this world except yourself, and that is not love, whatever fine name you have been giving it. He did not answer her. He went instead to his study and unlocked the drawer and took out the forged letter and read it again in the gray morning light, and for the first time let himself ask, plainly, who exactly stood to gain if this wedding never happened at all, a question he had been too grieved and too careful to ask himself in 9 weeks of protecting a woman who had never once asked to be protected from her own name. 3 miles away, in the miller's widow's small kitchen, Lynette had asked herself no such question yet, because she did not know a forged letter existed. She had only her father's true ledger, and the strange torn scrap folded inside her small notebook, and that first sleepless morning, nothing else to do with her hands but open both and set them side by side upon the table. The way she had watched her father set 2 accounts side by side 1,000 times, hunting the place where they ought to meet and did not. It took her the better part of the day to see it. The torn scrap, the one in her father's hand found among the estate's private papers, used a private shorthand in its margin, a small looping mark beneath certain figures, that her father had invented for her alone when she was 9 years old and struggling to keep her column straight. A mark that meant, in their old private language, look again, this is wrong. It appeared nowhere in any of his parish books. It appeared, she now saw, turning the scrap to the window light, beneath every one of the disputed Fenmore entries, as though her father, discovering the very fraud that would later be blamed on him, had marked it in the one code no forger could have known to imitate, because no forger, but his own daughter, had ever been taught it. She sat a long time with her hand flat on the page and heard her father's voice as clearly as if he stood behind her chair. Every entry balances, in the end, if you have the patience to find its pair. She had found it. It was near dusk when Tobias Rook came scratching at the widow's door, ink-stained and wretched, Aldous Penrose's own clerk, of 5 years. A young man Lynette had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with in her life, and stood on the step twisting his cap and saying he had heard from a groom where she had gone, and that he could not sleep another night with what he was carrying. She let him in. He would not sit. I copied the letter, Miss Hale. The confession. I copied it in your father's hand from samples Mr. Penrose gave me, and I told myself it was a kindness, closing an old matter quietly, and I have not slept a whole night since I did it, because I do not think it was ever a kindness at all. Who dictated its words to you, Tobias? Mr. Penrose himself, word for word, standing over my shoulder while I wrote it. That same evening, at Harrow Hall, Aldous Penrose learned from a frightened housemaid who had overheard Mrs. Betts telling the housekeeper's boy to run for Sir Robert at first light that Miss Hale had her father's ledger, and for one unguarded moment, crossing the hall with his gloves half on, his composure slipped entirely, his hand closing hard on the newel post as though the house itself had tilted beneath him, and Mrs. Betts, watching from the stair, thought with grim satisfaction that she had never in 15 years seen Aldous Penrose look so much like a man who had finally run out of ledger to balance. The storm that had been building over the western hills all that week broke at last the following evening, exactly as the household gathered in the long gallery at Harrow Hall, summoned by a note in Julian's own hand that named an hour and asked no questions. The very guests who had come for a wedding 4 times now arranged instead, without quite understanding how, into witnesses. Sir Robert Ainsworth stood at the room's center in his magistrate's capacity, grave and unhurried, and Lynette stood before him with her father's true ledger in one hand and the torn scrap in the other, Julian a pace behind her, close enough to stand with her rather than in front of her for what she understood. Watching him take that particular pace was perhaps the first time in the whole 8 months he had managed it. I will not detain this company long, Sir Robert said, as thunder moved somewhere beyond the tall windows and the candles along the gallery guttered and steadied. A grave accusation has been laid against a dead man's name. I mean to see it settled tonight, in this room, before every person here, so that no whisper of it may travel further unexamined. Miss Hale. She set the true ledger and the torn scrap side by side upon the long table, exactly as her father had taught her, and lifted the forged confession, retrieved that morning from Julian's locked drawer, and laid it beside the other 2. This, she said, her voice carrying further than she expected in the sudden hush, is said to be my father's hand, confessing to a theft he did not commit. It is a fair copy. Whoever made it studied him carefully. But my father taught me a private mark when I was 9 years old to flag an entry he distrusted, a mark he used nowhere else and told no one but me. It appears beneath every disputed line in his true hand, here, in a scrap found among the estate's own private papers 11 months before he died, the very scrap that shows he had discovered this fraud himself and was murdered, I believe, before he could carry it further than his own margins. It appears nowhere at all in the confession that was meant to condemn him, because the man who forged it did not know it existed. A ripple went through the gathered room, quickly stilled by Sir Robert's raised hand. Mr. Rook, he said, you copied this letter. Tobias, white to the lips, stepped forward from where he had been standing half-hidden near the door. I did, sir. At whose direction? The room went entirely silent, the storm outside filling the pause, and Tobias Rook looked once, briefly, at Aldous Penrose standing very still and very immaculate near the hearth, and then looked away from him for good. Mr. Penrose's, sir. He gave me samples of Josiah Hale's writing to copy from, and dictated the words himself, and told me it was a mercy to close an old matter cleanly. I have his own note to me still, sir, asking for the samples, in his own hand, which I kept because some part of me did not trust the kindness even as I did it. He drew the folded note from inside his coat and gave it to Sir Robert, who read it aloud into the silence, Penrose's own careful hand requesting, in words that could mean nothing else once set beside what they had produced, the very forgery that had cost Lynette 9 weeks and a wedding gown folded before dawn. Aldous Penrose did not run, and did not shout, and did not deny it, which was somehow more terrible than if he had. He only stood very still by the hearth, his composure, that famous gentle composure, cracking at last down its whole length, and when he spoke his voice had lost every trace of its habitual warmth, and come out instead thin and old. Your father found the discrepancy in the Western rents 11 months before he died, he said to Lynette directly, as though the room had emptied of everyone else. I had been drawing from Fenmore's timber accounts for 6 years by then, a little at a time, to keep my mother in the physician's care her lungs required, because I manage an estate that will never once be mine, and watch my cousin inherit what I only ever tend, and there did not seem, some years, to be a great difference between managing a fortune and being owed a small corner of it. Your father was going to lay the whole of it before my cousin's father. I gave him brandy laced heavier than he knew, the night he fell from his horse on the Fenmore Road, only to slow his tongue, only to buy myself time to set the accounts right before anyone need ever know. And he did not wake in the morning, and I have not slept an easy night since, whatever face I have shown this house. He looked, in that moment Lynette thought, watching him, not like a villain out of any story, but like a tired, frightened man, who had spent his whole life managing another man's fortune and calling the ache of that a kind of loyalty, and she found, to her own surprise, that what rose in her was not triumph, but something closer to grief. Sir Robert began the formal words that would summon a constable, and it was Julian who stopped him, laying a hand briefly on his arm. "No," Julian said. "Not the assizes, Robert. A public trial will drag my Uncle Stewart and this family's name through every newspaper from here to London, and will not give Josiah Hale back the 11 months he lost, nor the daughter the years she has already paid. Aldous will make full restitution to the Fenmore tenants from whatever remains to him, will resign the stewardship tonight, and will take passage abroad within the fortnight, on a settled allowance sufficient to keep his mother comfortable and not 1 shilling more. He will not return to this county while I hold it. That is mercy enough for what he has done, and more, I think, than he expected, and it is offered for the tenant's sake and Josiah Hale's name, not for his." Penrose's face, hearing it, did something complicated and unguarded, grief and shame, and something almost like relief moving across it together, and he bowed once, to Lynette particularly, a small broken motion, and said nothing more, and was led from the gallery as the storm outside began, at last, to ease. It was very late, the guests dispersed, the candles burned low, when Julian found Lynette alone in the estate office, where the whole business had first begun, standing over the 2 ledgers still lying open on the desk. "I owe you every apology a man has words for," he said, "and I find, now that the hour has come, that I do not know which to offer first." "You might begin," she said, not turning, "by telling me why you never once let me carry any of this beside you, when I asked you for exactly that 8 months ago in this very room." "Because I buried my mother and then my father within 18 months of each other, and learned from both of them that the dukes of this house love by disappearing beneath a burden so no one else need feel its weight. And I told myself I was sparing you when in truth I was only repeating the one lesson I had ever been taught about love, badly, on a woman who deserved a man capable of learning a better one. He crossed the room and stood before her, and did not reach for her hand, waiting instead to be permitted. "I am not offering you Fenmore now, Lynette, nor a rescue from any scandal, because there is no scandal left to rescue you from, and no deadline left to force my hand, Michaelmas or no Michaelmas. I am asking you to marry me because I cannot any longer imagine a ledger of my own life that balances without you in it, and because you were never, whatever I let you believe these past 9 weeks, my bad bargain. You were the only sum that ever came out whole." She looked at him a long moment, the way she had looked at the tenant rolls the very first Tuesday, hunting for the pair of an entry, and found, this time, that she did not need to look very long at all. "Then you had better ask me properly," she said, "since you have never yet managed it without a ledger between us. Will you marry me, Lynette Hale? Not for Fenmore, not for my name, only because I have asked you to, and because I find I would rather be poor and honest beside you than a duke of anything at all. Alone, yes," she said, and it was, after 4 failed mornings, remarkably simple to say. The wedding, when it came at last 3 weeks later, was a small one, by design, held in the parish church at Little Aldern rather than the grand chapel at the Hall, with none of the pomp the county had been promised and abandoned 4 times over. Mrs. Betts wept openly through the whole of it, and denied afterward that she had wept at all. Lady Frances Odell, who had once been spoken of as the more suitable match, and had carried a season's worth of cool gossip about the engagement's repeated collapse, came uninvited to the church door, stood through the ceremony at the back, and sought Lynette out afterward to say, plainly and without excuse, that she had been wrong to repeat what she had not troubled to verify, and wished her, sincerely, every happiness the county had so nearly cost her. She left the district within the year for a quiet, well-suited match near Bath, and was not spoken of unkindly in that house again. Tobias Rook was kept on at the estate, under Sir Robert's watchful sponsorship, and rose within 2 years to an honest clerkship of his own, his hands, it was said, never quite losing their habit of trembling faintly over another man's signature. Aldous Penrose's letters came twice yearly from the continent, brief, correct, unanswered by Julian, and read quietly and alone by Lynette, who could not, in the end, entirely close her heart against a man who had once loved a mother enough to ruin himself keeping her comfortable, however badly he had gone about it. Josiah Hale's true ledger was given a place of honor in the estate library beside the family Bible, and it was there, a year later, almost to the day, that Mrs. Betts found Lynette one September evening, heavy now with a child not yet come, teaching a village girl of 9 her sums at the very same desk, the same patient cadence in her voice her father had once used at a kitchen table by candlelight. Through the open window a bird was singing in the last of the light, a small brown bird with a russet breast that had nested in the ivy outside that window every summer since the wedding, and Julian, coming to find her as the dusk came down, stood a moment in the doorway watching her exactly as he had stood watching her the very first Tuesday, and thought that he had never once, in all his life, imagined a ledger could hold so much happiness and still balance true. On the bed in the room that had once been hers alone, put away now in cedar and lavender against the moths, the wedding gown lay still, folded, corner to corner, exactly as she had left it that dark morning, kept not as a wound any longer, but as a promise honored late, and some debts, she thought, watching the birds settle in the ivy, are paid at last, if you only have the patience to find their pair. If this story warmed you, the quiet ones who count so carefully, the loud silence of a good man learning too late that love is a thing meant to be carried together, then stay a while longer here by the fire with me. The kettle is on, the chair beside mine is empty and always will be for you, and I would love to know, in the comments, which line stayed with you longest, the folded gown, or the ledger's last entry, or the moment he finally learned to stand beside her instead of in front. Press that small bell and keep your place by this hearth, so the next story finds you the very moment the candle is lit again. Until then, go gently with the ones who count quietly and say little. Settle your own accounts honestly before you let anyone else close the door on them, and sleep well tonight, for every entry balances, in the end, if you only have the patience to find its pair.